Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. Exactly 1 year ago today, on December 3rd, martial law was declared in South Korea. It was a moment that pushed the nation's democracy to the edge. But in a special address this morning, President Lee Jae Myung called it a turning point that showed the world Korea's democratic power. He praised the people's nonviolent resistance as historic, saying they've shown the kind of leadership that deserves a Nobel Peace Prize. But while celebrating that, he also called the revolution of light, and President Lee made clear that the revolution is not over. Trials are still underway, and justice, he said, must come before forgiveness. So what has Korea truly gained, and what must still be faced? For a deeper discussion on this, we are joined in the studio by two experts. Hans Schadl, Professor of Political Science at Yonsei University to my right. Thank you, Professor, for coming.
Thank you for having me, Mok-yeon. Nice to see you.
Good to see you. And also to my left, we have attorney Kim Ji-soo. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me again.
So let's start our discussion with Professor Schadl, a recap of the past year. Let's begin with that. So since the declaration of the martial law, how much progress do you think has Korea's democracy made since then? And also, how would you assess the overall resilience of Korea's democratic system?
Right. I think resilience is such an important frame, Mok-yeon, to look at the past year. And we can look at resilience through political institutions and also through political culture. And in terms of the governing institutions, I think that the system really did work. The assembly followed through with impeachment. The courts followed through with removal from power. Former President Yoon Suk-yeol left office. And then we turn to the political culture. It was the people, as has been remembered all day today, and I think is being commemorated this evening with citizens' rallies and marches in Yeouido, even at this hour. The people turned out to defend their democracy when it was attacked seemingly out of nowhere by a president ready to go rogue. And the public continued to show up for protests day after day, and the elections went forward despite a lot of ongoing polarization in the society, and I think we can talk about that. The elections went forward, the results were accepted. The current president, Lee Jae Myung, now enjoys a fairly high approval rating, consistently above 50%, sometimes even approaching 60% in the first several months. That's not something to take for granted in a society that has a lot of contentious issues to deal with. And I would say also on the question of polarization, I was reading a public opinion poll earlier this week that pointed out that 77% of the public is worried about the degree that people see themselves as too much at odds in the society, that polarization as in people just seeing themselves not as unified, as fundamentally divided on insurmountable issues. I think the fact that 77% of the public is worried about polarization in the first place sounds not so good, but actually I take it more hopefully. I take it as a sign that the concern on that issue also suggests a willingness to find ways to deal with it. And I think that's where all sides in the country's political world really need to go.
That's an important way to look at it. We'll go back to the polarization aspect as we speak. But before that, Professor, in a special address this morning, President Lee Jae Myung called the past year as a historic moment of democratic power. And he also said that even, Koreans actually deserve the Nobel Peace Prize as well. Do you think that message actually will help to shape global conception about Korea's democracy?
Right. I mean, who knows what the Nobel Committee will do every year? It's always a surprise when they issue the awards. But I would say one thing that's very clear is the rallies the people held were peaceful. I mean, we all remember images of that cold night in December 3rd, where soldiers had been dispatched to the assembly. We're not totally sure yet what they were going to have to do. I think they had some orders, but they were unsure about following them, as it seems it turned out. And we saw videos of ajumas and ajoshis, aunts and uncles, middle-aged men and women running up to these soldiers and yelling at them and telling them to lay off and back off. I think there was even one viral photo of a woman approaching a soldier who was armed and basically staring him down. So even though the protests were confrontational, they were confronting an abuse of power, and they were ultimately peaceful. You know, when we think about the K-pop concert light sticks that were at many of the rallies that followed that first night. And you know, there's story after story. In fact, I think President Lee mentioned it in his speech today, that the people stood up for their democracy at a very critical moment. I mean, I was home when I heard the news of the martial law declaration late at night. And I would say for the first hour or so, as I was just digesting this, I mean, there had been some indicators that the president was thinking of doing something extreme, but I don't think anybody expected it when it happened so suddenly. And for that hour or so, I felt a bit like I was in a mousetrap, you know, teaching political science in a country that's going under martial law. What does that mean? But I just kept thinking, well, the next day I'm going to go to school and teach normally, and I'm just carrying on business as usual until that's disrupted. So, but then I was heartened so quickly after that to hear about how the citizenry was indeed turning up at the assembly, and even Lee Jae Myung himself, who was in the assembly at the time, jumping over, you know, walls and gates to get in. And there's a lot of metaphor to that too. I mean, anytime we talk about walls being erected and then walls being overcome, and they can be walls of any kind, and that's something certainly that the assembly members did to defend their institution. So that was really the beginning, I think, that one night, of the institution of the assembly setting the tone for the rest of the country's constitutional democracy to prevail, with the people out there again peacefully protesting to defend it. And you know, that is something that I think publics the world over take note. There are several countries, Brazil would be another example, where authoritarian power grabs have been fought off by citizenries and institutions. So Korea joins those ranks with this incident, as painful as it was at the time.
Right, so it was definitely a very shocking incident that shed light on the power of democracy, especially among the citizens in Korea. Now, let's also shed light to the legal front, attorney. The martial law trial seems to be wrapping up. Could you remind us of our viewers, where does the case of former President Yoon Suk-yeol actually stand right now?
So actually, our former President Yoon is confronting two separate trials. And one is the sedition case, where he's charged as the ringleader of an attempted insurrection. And I probably think this is the most famous trial that is going on. The case is being held by Seoul Central District Court's Criminal Division 25, presided over by Judge Lee Jae Myung. And the other case, handled by Criminal Division 35, under Judge Baek Dae-hyun, deals with allegations that he abused his authority by pressuring military officials to take part in this illegal mobilization plan. But I guess the sedition trial is the main one in this question, and the court has recently set a very clear schedule for the final wrap-ups. They announced that the last three hearings, January 5th, 7th and 9th, will be the closing arguments, and January 9th will effectively wrap up the trial. And normally in Korea, the verdict comes out about a month later after the closing arguments, since the judge needs time to write the concrete judgment documentations after the argument is over. So realistically, we're looking around mid-February or early spring verdict for the first instance decision.
Right, so we're really getting close to the verdict. Now, looking at the case itself, the trial itself, attorney, what have been the main points of contention in the sedition case, and also what should the court actually be paying closest attention to?
Well, since this incident has been shocking, and also it requires a lot of legal going through the papers. So there are a lot of contentions right here, but I'm just going to point out three main key points. So first, it was about premeditation, whether there were discussed early drafts or early meetings before the December 3rd regarding the declaration of martial law. And if pre-planning has been proven, it is a definite, strong legal evidence that supports the sedition charge. And this issue is at the center of the military trial where defendant Kim Mok-yeon is taking place. And second key point is whether they were an attempt to neutralize the National Assembly. So the court is pressing hard on troop movement plans, on whether there was a real intention in order to neutralize National Assembly by preventing our congressmen to go into the meeting itself. And this has been examined most deeply in police-related trial, which is defended by Cho Jin-ho. And lastly, not but least, the act of targeting the National Election Commission. So currently, the defendant Kim Mok-yeon is strongly saying that there has been a rigged election. So that was the reason why they had troops into the election commission. However, that allegation is valid for right now. And so to the question on which element seems to be drawing the most attention from the bench, I definitely would say when we look closely at the courtroom, they are looking whether there was a coordinated attempt. So which means that these actors move separately or as part of a one coordinated plan. And that broader picture is being handled in the former President Yoon's trials right now. And for just a further context, once the witness examination finalizes, all three trials that are where defendant Kim Mok-yeon, where defendant Cho Jin-ho, and where defendant Yoon is holding, is going to be merged into a single court. And so that it will enable the judges to know whether the allegations is true or not.
And all of this, the verdicts we're expecting in around 3 months.
Yes.
Thank you for that, Attorney. Now, let's zoom out a little bit again, Professor, and consider the broader political climate. We've touched upon, the polarization of the public in South Korea. Could you elaborate for us, explain for us deeper, like what is actually bringing this deep divide?
Right. What are some underlying factors here? When you have a population, say, of 50 million people, and there are differing versions of the truth, or differing fundamental concerns of the public. Where do they come from? And I think one factor, not only in Korea, but in many democracies around the world right now, would be the changes we've seen in media ecosystems in the high-tech age, where the public doesn't watch the same news broadcasts altogether anymore. The public isn't even reading the same set of newspapers. I mean, this is not the only cause, but today, so many of my students get their news primarily from social media platforms. Many older folks, even in this country, are listening more to opinion makers rather than actual news-gathering journalists whose work has been vetted by professional editors. So the public ends up with very differing accounts of the truth and different sets of heroes and villains. And this is true right now in my native country, in the US as well. We're struggling with similar patterns of polarization. So I think a lot rides on the capacity of the citizenry to do the work, and also for us to educate the next generations to look at news content critically and seek out very true and fair and valid news content. Beyond that, there are some other factors in this country's political system that can drive polarization. The political institutions here, while resilient, there is a kind of winner-take-all nature to the way power is structured, particularly in the executive and the single-chamber legislative branch. So if you've got the president and the assembly in the control of the same political party, they can get a lot done, but the minority party can become a kind of permanent opposition, and or at least, stuck in paralysis for a period of time until they can gain power again, where there's very little they can do. And then the citizens that support that minority party can feel as if they have no voice in the government. So that, too, can be a problem, I think. And the country also has a very strong presidency, in which power, in some ways that's good, things can get done, but it also means that power is not necessarily distributed. So there's pros and cons with a political system where the power is concentrated, where the power might be dispersed a little bit and more widely shared. There are ways to rethink the way the executive and legislative branches could distribute power, and some of those factors could be thought about in the months and years ahead, too.
A very important point. Professor has just highlighted the importance of distribution of power. Now, speaking of which, there are also calls for a constitutional reform in the country. Attorney Kim, the 4-year presidential term, we're actually talking about this lately, and one re-election that's going to be allowed. Do you think that could actually really help reduce polarization in the nation?
So before we delve into the question, I also noticed that a lot of people are intrigued by the notion of reformation of Constitution. And I do know that the agenda of these 4-year and 2-term presidency is to relieve the president-focused power, so to decentralize that power. So I definitely understand why these interests are coming from. However, I think before we think of these solutions, we need to dig deeper into the root of polarization. And I personally think that it mainly comes from a winner-takes-all political culture, as our professor mentioned it before, and also from a presidency that holds too much centralized authority compared to other nations. And I think that is a fundamental problem that we have in regarding presidency. So I think the focus should be on rebalancing power itself, not just adjusting the terms or the years by itself. So the real question is how much power should stay with one president and how much it must be shared, checked, or limited or regulated by other institutions. And I personally think the timing is perfect for this kind of discussion because in the past, constitutional reform kept failed because the Reformation was driven by party interests. So, but after the December 3rd crisis, I think people now see a more deeper structural problem regarding president institutions. And so this makes, I think, is a genuine opportunity for us to approach to a more meaningful institutional reform.
Right, definitely. So these kinds of efforts would be definitely necessary moving forward. But as of now, we've seen a year pass since the martial law declaration and the crisis has been done. Now, so as of now, Professor, what kind of challenges do you think still remains, and what kind of challenges still exist in building a stronger democracy for South Korea?
Well, I think with the institutions that we currently have, working with what the country is going to live with, I think somehow the various parties, of course the two main parties, but even the smaller parties as well, need to try to find some common ground on some key issues that matter a lot to the people. I always like to point out, especially at election time, and I'll repeat it now, that when we look at what the different parties talk about when elections roll around, when it comes to the education system or the cost of housing or the quality of life or opportunities for small or medium-sized businesses or dealing with youth underemployment, real problem for young adults today, or of course the population crisis. Recently, it seems that we may be starting another resurgence in new babies being born, which is very good news. That's like one step forward, it seems, for the society. But how do you create the conditions that make it more affordable and appealing for families to live here? I think the public's really hungry to see a political establishment that becomes more responsive to these kinds of concerns. So one thing that the various political parties can do is try to come up with some consensus on these kinds of issues that have to do with social welfare, economic well-being, maybe shorten the work week. I think the two parties are not too far on those issues, where say the DP and the PPP can come together and show the country a win-win. Now that may be hard to do when the PPP, much of it, is still supporting former President Yoon. There are some members of the PPP today, actually, not a large number, about 24 of them, I think 25, that apologized for the martial law fiasco. That's a baby step forward, at least, for the PPP to try to start to rehabilitate itself and for that cohort of lawmakers to start to work with other political parties. Ultimately, politics in a democracy does not always yield perfection. But the idea is to come up with policy solutions and laws and reforms that the country and its people can live with and go forward productively. And I think that's a general prescription for any country trying to come out of a rough patch, especially when it comes to polarization.
And as you said, a big approach would be to listen to the public, what they really want, to their voices.
Absolutely, yes.
Now, before we let you go, President Lee has also emphasized national unity and popular sovereignty. And today, he also called for what he described as a just unity. Attorney, what kind of steps do you think are needed to actually turn that message into real, lasting national unity?
Okay, so before I came here, I actually went back and reviewed President Lee's 21st presidential election pledge book, and I found some agendas where he actually pointed out what kind of things we need to do in order to have our nations unified and in order to relieve any kind of polarization from the results of elections. And his agendas were as follows. First, ending cycles of political retaliation, of course. And secondly, strengthening direct democracy. And lastly, introducing a recall system for lawmakers. So before I delve into the main part, I would like to briefly mention about the agendas that he talked about on the aspects of lawyers. So the recall systems or any kind of mechanisms that brings citizens into a direct participation is very idealistic, and it is a good conceptualization. However, in practical norm, it kind of seems unrealistic because it needs a lot of reformations, a lot of lawmaking process are needed. However, I do wanted to present them because it is a kind of a path that we need to step forward to. So President Lee definitely has provided a lot of mechanisms that citizens can actually participate. For example, the recall system is where citizens can actually vote to remove elected offices from its office. And also he talked about a lot of citizens' assembly, national sovereignty committees, and even a citizen-led constitutional initiatives. And those are quite very progressive forms, I would say. However, I think all these kind of policies are really good. However, one fundamental thing should be considered is the fact that there needs to be a clear and responsible ground in sharing information before we start this kind of policy to be initiated. Because I think a lot of polarization and a lot of disputes happening in Korea right now has been derived from a lot of news that has been that led people to be polarized, that I would say false news or manipulative news that drives people to fight to each other. So I think we need a healthier community, or we need more stronger ethical legal duties for new organizations before we delve into such kind of progressive matters.
A strong, very strong message that we could end our discussion on tonight. Thank you so much for your insights, Attorney Kim.
Thank you.
And of course, Professor Shuttle, we really appreciate your time and insights.
Thank you, Mok-yeon. Thank you for having me.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame tonight. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.